Hello, everyone. Well, in case you didn't know, I got put in YouTube jail, so to speak, for a week and was unable to post because of uh, medical misinformation, I was told, from my last video, which was taken down. So I thought I would share with you the American Institute for Economic Research. Uh, this article came out November 22nd. Asymptomatic spread revisited. The phrase fog of war is attributed to Karl von Clausewitz. It's come to refer to the confusion and uncertainty felt by everyone in the midst of conflict. It's often unclear who's making decisions and why, and what the relationships are between the strategies and the goals. Even the rationale can become elusive as frustration and disorientation displace clarity and rationality. In 2020, we experienced the fog of disease mitigation. The initial round of lockdowns was not about suppressing the virus, but slowing it for one reason: to preserve hospital capacity. Whether and to what extent the curve is actually flattened will probably be debated for years, but back then there was no question of extinguishing the virus. The volume of the curves, tall and quick or short and long, was the same either way. People were going to get the bug until the bug burns out. Herd immunity. Gradually, and sometimes almost imperceptibly, the rationale for the lockdowns changed. Curve flattening became an end in itself, apart from hospital capacity. Perhaps this was because the hospital crowding issue was extremely localized in two New York boroughs, while hospitals around the country emptied out for patients who didn't show up. 350 hospitals furloughed workers. That failure was embarrassing enough given the overwhelming cost. Schools closed, commercial rights were vanquished, shelter in place orders from wartime were imposed, travel nearly stopped, all large events were canceled, and so on. Clearly, there needed to be a good, solid, science based reason for why the politicians and their advisors had, on their own, decided to take away much of what we once regarded as human rights. Talk about this began in March but faded. Sometime in summer, the idea of asymptomatic spread started to trend bit by bit. It finally went to an explosion of interest in the first week of June. It trailed off again until very recently. Asymptomatic spread was the answer given to the great question: I'm not sick, so why would I have to be locked down? Why are we quarantining the healthy? And what possibly could it mean, in any case, to be sick without symptoms? Why are half the PCR positive tests assigned to people who otherwise seem to be perfectly fine? All of these valid questions came to be answered by this one phrase: asymptomatic spread. You might not feel sick. You might not ever have symptoms of SARS-CoV-2. Still, you could be an even worse super spreader without knowing it, infecting people all around you who will carry it to people who will die from the disease. This was also the moment when, subtly and imperceptibly, we were being asked to think of our fellow citizens not as human beings with dignity and rights, but pathogen-carrying disease vectors. We had to be masked, all of us, because we're secretly filthy and unclean. We cannot be allowed to breathe near others, or even with a mask, we must stay 6 feet away. As I type these words, I feel sure that if anyone reads them in 10 years, the reader will assume I'm writing fiction or engaged in wild hyperbole. Hyperbole. Sorry, I got tongue tied. To the future reader, this is all true. On June 7th, Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, head of the WHO's Emerging Diseases and Zoonosis Unit, told a press conference from the known research, asymptomatic spread was very rare. From the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual. She added for emphasis, quote unquote, it's very rare. And James Miller on the 23rd shared this. A study conducted in China involving 10 million people showed asymptomatic spread is a myth. Major news. So why is no media outlet covering it? Makes you wonder who's making decisions and why. Yep, we've known this all along, says Dr. Maria van Kerkhove. And let's listen what she had to
What
say.
proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit? So the way that we look at that is we look at these individuals need to be followed carefully over the course of when they're detected and looking at secondary transmission. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And that not much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data, and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. What we really want to be focused on is following the symptomatic cases. If we followed all of the symptomatic cases, because we know that this is a respiratory pathogen, it passes from an individual through infectious droplets. If we actually followed all of the symptomatic cases, isolated those cases, follow the contacts and quarantine those contacts, we would drastically reduce. I would love to be able to give a proportion of how much transmission we would actually stop, but it would be a drastic reduction in transmission. If we could focus on that, I think we would do very, very well in terms of suppressing transmission. But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a second.
So 3 times I heard her say it. Very rare. It's very rare. It's very rare. There was an understandable explosion of fury on all sides. People against lockdowns were screaming all over Twitter that this is true. The rationale for the lockdowns mostly disappears. We can go back to our normal lives. We can open up everything again. And I wrote at the time, the author of this study, that is, what this suggests, of course, is that there is nothing mysteriously magical or insidious about this new virus. It behaves like viruses that scientists have been studying for 100 years. What we do with a normal virus is be careful around others when we have symptoms. We don't cough and sneeze on people and generally stay home if we are sick. That's how it's always been. You don't need a lockdown to achieve that. You just need to proceed with life as normal, treating the sick and otherwise not disrupting life. If that is the case with this one, everything we've done over the past months, the mask wearing, the grasshopper dance not to be next to people, the canceling of everything, the wild paranoia and pre-modern confusions, has been a calamitous and destructive waste of energy, time, and money. On the other hand, there was the predictability pro-lockdown mainstream media which derided their heresy. The cry was so loud that the WHO immediately started walking back the claim, mostly with hints and suggestions that did say untrue things, but did not repudiate the initial claim either. There's much to be answered on this. There's much that is unknown. It is clear both the symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals are part of the transmission cycle. The question is, what is the relative contribution to each group to the overall number of cases? Following that, the question seemed to fade. We went back to assuming that potentially everyone had a disease, enabling fellow citizens to become virtuous enforcers of mask wearing, staying home and separating, screaming and yelling at others for failing to comply. The science on the question was unsettled, we were told. So let us get back to wrecking life as we once knew it. The fog of disease mitigation, indeed, but as with most of the science throughout this ordeal, it eventually came to be revealed that good sense and rationality would prevail over some implausible claims, that predictions that led to experiments in social control without any precedent. In this case, the carrier of rationality, a gigantic study conducted in Wuhan, China, of 10 million people. This article appears in Nature, published November 20th, 2020. Post-lockdown SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid screening in nearly 10 million residents in Wuhan, China. The conclusion is not that asymptomatic spread is rare or that the science is uncertain. The study revealed something that hardly ever happens in these kinds of studies. There was not one documented case Forget rare, forget even Fauci's previous suggestion that asymptomatic transmission exists, but does not drive the spread. Replace all that with never, at least not in this study for the 10 million people. Stringent COVID-19 control measures were imposed in Wuhan between January 23rd and April 8, 2020. Estimates of the prevalence of infection following the release of restrictions could inform post-lockdown pandemic management. Here, we describe a citywide SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid screening program between May 14th and June 1st in Wuhan. The city residents aged 6 or older were eligible, and 9,899,828, 92.9% participated. No new symptomatic cases and 300 asymptomatic cases. Detection rate 0.303 out of 10,000, 95%. 0.270 to 0.339 out of 10,000 were identified. There were no positive tests among 1,174 close contacts of asymptomatic cases. 107 of 34,424 previously recovered COVID-19 patients tested positive again. Read-positive rate. The prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 infection in Wuhan was therefore very low 5 to 8 weeks after the end of the lockdown. One might suppose that this would be huge news. It would allow us to open up everything immediately. With the whole basis for the post-curve flattening lockdowns crumbled, we could go back to living a normal life. The fear could evaporate. We could take comfort in our normal intuition that healthy people can get out and about with no risk to others. We could take off our mask. We could go to the movies and sports events. But from what I can tell, there was only one news story that was posted about this, and it was on Russia Today. I have not been able to find another one. People not following the right accounts on Twitter wouldn't even know about it at all. We keep hearing about how we should follow the science. The claim is tired by now. We know what's really happening. The lockdown lobby ignores whatever contradicts their narrative, preferably unverified anecdotes over the actual science study of 10 million residents in what was the world's first major hotspot for the disease we're trying to manage. You would expect this study to be massive international news. So far as I can tell, it's being ignored. With solid evidence that asymptomatic spread is nonsense, we have to ask, who is making the decisions and why? Again, this brings me back to the metaphor of fog. We are all experiencing confusion and uncertainty over the precise relationship between the strategies and the goals of panoply of regulations and stringencies all around us. Even the rationale has become elusive, even refuted, as frustration and disorientation have displaced what we vaguely recall as clarity and rationality of daily life. And here we are, 10 months or more after all of this, and people are still walking around with masks. You can't walk in Sprouts without the young man chasing you down if you dare try to walk past him. And most places are like that, and people are still driving around in their cars. Big, strong guys in Texas in their big trucks, alone in their trucks with their mask on. People walking their dogs. I mean, the insanity is just so beyond my comprehension. Some days I want to pull my hair out. The apartment complex where we live, the office has been closed since the beginning of this. You still cannot go to the office where they used to accept packages when we received packages and you could go to the office and pick them up. No, can't do that. COVID, we have to be scared. We have to social distance. We have to wear our mask. Somebody might be sick. It's just, healthy people do not spread disease. Anthony Fauci needs to go and F